thank you again, everyone, for coming. I'm sure, or I would hope that you're aware of what's going on overseas, and so I really just want to start tonight, since I'm so frazzled, and keeping you all waiting, to just take a moment of silence for all the lives lost and unaccounted for over in Israel and Palestine, and those who continue to suffer. And I would just like us to honor their memory and wish that we all have the courage and determination to make some kind of change so that hopefully no more people lose their lives and those who have do not die in vain. So I'll just take a moment of silence. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to do, I'm going to just share with you some reflections that I've written about what's happening right now. And then I want to read from my memoir. I published this for the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel last year in May for the Nakba, which is also the Nakba for Palestinians, 75th commemoration. So after I share my reflections, I'm just going to read you some passages. I know some of you may have gotten to read some excerpts, and I'll be reading something different from what you were assigned in case you were able to read that. I'm pretty sure today marks the 159th day. I mean, we're over 5 months into this, what I call current crisis. That's left initially just over 1,100 Israelis were killed, and now we've had more than 30,000 Palestinians who've been killed in Gaza and counting. But I'm not here to go over all these statistics. They're readily available. I'm actually a writing mentor for an organization called We Are Not Numbers. And basically, we encourage Palestinians to write their stories, their experiences, wherever they may be, and we share them with the world. There's a website for that. I encourage you to look that up. And so I'm really not here to talk about numbers at all. So you may have heard of Rafat al-Arir. He's a poet, who was a poet and a professor at the Islamic University in Gaza. He was killed by an Israeli airstrike in October. And he is one of the co-founders of We Are Not Numbers. And so it was especially unsettling, to say the least, to see not only him be killed by an airstrike and members of his family, but also some of our writers, young writers. And I'm also a co-host with the Palestine Museum, which is in Woodbridge, Connecticut, and we do weekly films, and we invite artists and writers and journalists to come on the program on Saturdays and Sundays. And so I have shared some of his poetry through that medium with the world. Anyway, needless to say, I think you might have heard me say when I was a student here, my father was teaching German. He's actually was born and raised under Nazi Germany. He was a child soldier in the Hitler Youth. He survived the Battle of Berlin, if that means anything to you. So I'm not Palestinian. I wasn't born Palestinian, but I did marry a Palestinian. So that's my full disclosure. I have 3 Palestinian children who are adults. And I've spent my life worrying about this issue, in part because of my German heritage, but also because of what I witnessed personally when I traveled there. I first went to Jerusalem and Gaza back in 1986. It was at the tail end of my junior year abroad from here. And what jumped out at me right away was the discrepancy, if that's a good word to say, between the family I visited in Gaza, who were refugees in their own homeland, and this young American Jewish family who, through the law of return, had just emigrated to Israel. One of my father's colleagues' daughters. And so both of those families welcomed me and my brother. We traveled together into their homes, and I got to see one family have all the rights and privileges of what's called the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, and compare that to this family in Gaza who were originally from Jaffa, who were refugees in their own homeland, and they remain that way today. The mother who hosted me at the time, she died in January in Gaza. She's severely diabetic and didn't have access, of course, to anything she needed, living under horrendous conditions. And dozens of members of that extended family have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. So it's very personal for me, but it's also, I always kind of step back and take the big picture because I think we need to look forward and not get too caught up in all the pain and the suffering, even in spite of the fact that that's where we are right now. So I was a student here of international studies, and I was studying at a time during the Cold War when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were, battling out their spheres of influence in the world. And I was very aware of the fact that people in power have the power to draw lines and determine the fate of other people who may not have as much power in this world, whether it's indigenous populations around the world or people who live within spheres that are under the influence of those superpowers. I just want to give you a little more sense of my background. I've lived many chapters, so I've written a book about Palestine, but I've also lived many chapters, which a lot of them are in here. This covers 30 years. But I mentioned I'm a mother of 3 Palestinians, but I also did my PhD in higher education, so I studied higher education in Palestine as a vehicle for identity and resistance and state building. And I also was a policy person at the University of Wisconsin System Administration, increasing access for marginalized groups here in the U.S. to higher education, both students and faculty and staff. My husband and I have also had a couple of restaurants. That was another way of, embracing Palestinian heritage and sharing it with the world, although both of us felt like that's not quite enough, even though there's some great people out there running restaurants and doing great work to raise awareness about what's happening. But we both went back and got our PhDs, and so currently my sons, I have 2 sons and a daughter, are working with their father in the Jenin area, exporting olive oil and other artisan food products out of that area to the world to put Palestine on the shelf, even though it's officially not on the map. And I'm focusing on sharing my experiences about Palestine and what I've witnessed as a human being, and kind of navigating what has become of that part of the world. So I think some of you in here are in writing classes. I'm not sure, is that true? So for me, story is one of the oldest forms of recording the human experience. People have passed down stories through over generations. And so in my life, I've fallen back on story. All the things I tried to do, which I didn't go all into. I feel like the most powerful weapon that I have, if you want to call it that, is to share my experience, my words with the world, and in the hope of making human connections about what's happening on the ground in Israel and Palestine. As you may know, the Palestinian experience over the whole last century is marked by other people and powers making decisions on behalf of Palestinians. We still have our great leaders speaking on behalf of Palestinians, saying what the day after should look like, not really consulting with Palestinians or giving them equal footing in negotiations. We've seen declarations, accords, and lots of excuses, too numerous to mention, about that basically has silenced Palestinian voices and disregarded their right to self-determination. So what I witnessed today is that Palestinian lives have been deemed unworthy of the rights and freedoms that Western powers, like the United States, And those privileged in Israel, the Jewish community in Israel, have secured for themselves. And so today, I think we're witnessing one of the most blatant dehumanization of the Palestinian people that I've ever witnessed, and I've seen a lot. It's almost as if all Palestinians deserve to die, whether it's grandparents down to babies. And yet, I think it's important to understand that in the historical context of colonialism and also Orientalism. So the way people view the other, which has kind of divided the world into like the civilized and the uncivilized. We've heard of the clash of civilizations. All this kind of language, it's about othering certain people, elevating some over others. And that's what we witness in Palestine. So as neatly as world powers have drawn lines over the centuries, you may know about the French and the British carving up the Middle East with the Sykes-Picot Accord way back after World War I, which resulted in Britain having a British mandate over Palestine. But I think it's important to view the world through the lens of the values and institutions that these very powerful countries like the United States uphold. We've heard of recent proceedings led by South Africa, the International Court of Justice. We've seen fleeting attempts to call for a ceasefire at the United Nations Security Council, only to be vetoed again and again by the U.S. The U.S. has ultimate say in that circle. And there have been numerous attempts to hold the state of Israel accountable for its actions against Palestinians, to hold it accountable to international law. And these are just a few illustrations of what I consider a disconnect between Western democracies that stand for freedom and justice and dignity, and the actions of those in office who represent these nations and allegedly espouse these values that many of us hold dear. So I would call this a hypocrisy, and it's not new, but it's sort of more blatant than ever in this particular situation. As we witness the unbridled backing of the U.S. and other Western nations who are supporting Israel's right to self-defense, following the Hamas penetration of the Gaza fence, this multi-billion-dollar fence, and this horrific attack on Jewish communities outside of that fence, the border communities. And you know, that resulted in probably the most unanticipated act of resistance we have ever witnessed among the Palestinian community. Regardless of where you stand on that, it's what it was. Among other things, of course, many people were killed through this act of resistance. So I'm really not here. I'm not interested in anyone putting me on trial about do I condone or condemn, blah, blah, blah. You've heard all that before. You know, kind of the way university presidents in this country have been put on trial. You know, do you support genocide? Would you defend genocide? Would you condemn it? You know, all these things that we've witnessed kind of in these congressional hearings. But what I want to ask you to do, if your mind goes there, is just check yourself, and just let's focus on the bigger picture that began long before October 7th. And that like 9/11, it will be branded in our minds as this important date in history that changed everything. I think that's really true. It really shook the world and changed the equation on the ground in Palestine and Israel. But it's important to know that historical context. And so I think what's lacking from events like this is the wisdom that can come from that. Back in 9/11, I thought, boy, this is a chance for us to really sink in and self-reflect on American policy toward the Middle East and elsewhere. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. And President Biden alluded to that. He said, he admitted that the American response to 9/11, he said, people in power often err on the side of revenge rather than a rational response. And I feel that we can say that about the state of Israel, that what is happening since October 7th goes way beyond self-defense, and it's more erring on the side of revenge at the cost of tens of thousands of Palestinian lives. So both the United States and Israel are armed with arsenals that could put all of us in the grave. And yet both embrace war, uh, war against those who have a bone to pick with American policy or Israeli policy, and have reduced people's cries for freedom and democracy to anti-Semitism and terrorism. So after 9/11, the short-sightedness of our response and others to 9/11 resulted in the Iraq War, the rise of ISIS, civil war in Syria. We got all caught up in Afghanistan, and I feel like, for what? Some kind of zero-sum game. I don't think much came of it. And in the current crisis, I would call what's happening a kind of moral bankruptcy within Israel that allows itself as a nation. There are people, there are Israelis on the ground who support the actions of their government. This is not just Benjamin Netanyahu, on some streak of revenge. It's people really, a lot of people that really feel like this is what has to happen. This is the way Israel has to respond to keep Israelis safe. But it's really resulting in the slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians. As you know, their homes have been destroyed. The entire infrastructure on the ground has been destroyed. And all of the universities that I did interviews at in 2000, they're all gone, and all the new ones that came after. So all the students who are in Gaza have nowhere to finish their studies. Of course, right now they're not even thinking about that. They're just trying to survive day to day, if they're still alive. And yet all anybody there really wants, which is what we all want, is to live with dignity. Palestinians want to live with dignity in their homeland. So, but Israel has been very convincing to the Western world, the United States, to kind of lump all these Palestinian cries for freedom and democracy into anti-Semitism and terrorism, including those who stand in solidarity with what's happening, who just question it, who say, we want a ceasefire now. People lose their jobs, or worse, and I don't think that's helpful. So, ironically, historically, we have celebrated acts of resistance. Usually kind of after the fact, we get some distance, and then we're like, we of course celebrated all the resistance against Nazi Germany and in the Warsaw Ghetto. We celebrate Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, and even Malcolm X, although he advocated for all violent resistance. Nelson Mandela in South Africa was considered a terrorist, and then he became a statesman, and of course many others. And most recently, the Western world has embraced the resistance in Ukraine against the Russian invasion there, and backed that effort with billions of dollars, while supporting Israel's assault on the population in Gaza, with, sometimes in the same congressional resolution. So, anyway, and meanwhile, all the humanitarian aid is piling up on the border, and we're still sending weapons. So hopefully we can get past that. Not in time for Ramadan, but here we are. So anyway, it's this whole hypocrisy that I witnessed way back in 1986 when I was there for 6 weeks, and it's kind of just planted a seed in me that it's just continued to grow. And so it drives my determination to, especially now, never stop talking about Palestine. Like, my daughter's like, Mama, can't you talk about anything else? And it's like, this is our future. What do you want me to do? So I can only encourage others to do the same, until the Western nations, the values match the policy. That's really all I would expect. And we've exported these values of democracy and human rights and international law. People believe us all around the world. Well, not anymore, but for a long time, people really were like, wow, the United States really stands for something. And I don't think we can quite convince people of that in the current situation. So that's a problem. I think it puts Americans in danger, and certainly lots of other lives around the world. We know that the people in the global south have borne the brunt of this hypocrisy that I'm mentioning. And so it's really important to hold elected leaders accountable. And I know here in Michigan, you may have heard of the Listen to Michigan campaign, where people voted uncommitted here and got 100,000 people in Michigan to vote uncommitted to send President Biden a signal that, hey, you need to listen to the people who elected you and not support these atrocities in Gaza. And I'm in Wisconsin now. It's another battleground state, and people in Wisconsin are running with that same energy to try to send the same signal, and it's happening kind of all across the United States. So what would accountability look like in Israel and Palestine? Really important is to acknowledge the Nakba. So much of what has happened in the discourse the last, I don't know, since Oslo 20 years ago it's been all about 1967, but this goes back to the beginning of Zionism in the 1800s, and certainly the Nakba in 1948. And so what happened in 1948 was so horrific. Huge historical trauma there for Palestinians, and yet what's happening now puts that all to shame. The Israeli leaders didn't even acknowledge the Nakba. You're not allowed to commemorate it, and yet now they're like, yes, we're gonna do another one. So here we are. That's what we've been witnessing the last 5 months. So I think it's important to understand that this premise of Zionism that sought to reconfigure Palestine into a Jewish state of Israel was flawed by design. And so all the hundreds of years of persecution of Jews and culminating in the Holocaust under Nazi Germany do not justify seizing Palestine and turning it into Israel. That's not to discredit the connection of Jews to the ancient land of Israel. There is that historic connection, and maintaining a Jewish presence in Palestine. But it's quite another thing to then just try to erase not only Palestine from the map, but also the people of Palestine from their homeland. So that's kind of the problem with this picture from the get-go. So fortunately, we have lots of Jews around the world, and here in the United States, Jewish Voice for Peace, there's If Not Now, they're standing together in Israel. There's lots of organizations who are speaking out as Jews and saying, not in my name. And that never again is for everyone. Never again was one of the slogans after the Holocaust. So it's important to recognize that Israel doesn't speak for all Jews, and that Zionism is not Judaism, and that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic. These are all things that people in the Jewish community who are speaking out about Palestine are saying in their own words. So for me, if I look at the situation now, in Palestine and Israel, we have two identities. We have a Palestinian identity and an Israeli identity, but in spite of this whole apartheid system on the ground that basically subjects, where Palestinians live in Israel's shadow, there is actually a binational state already. Half of the people who live there are Palestinian, and half of them are Jewish Israelis. So that is a fact, and I call that binationalism. Israel says it's a Jewish state, but if half of your people are not Jewish, then it's not a Jewish state. I'm sorry, you can define it that way. That's what apartheid is. So that's why people have called Israel an apartheid state. So you have two tumultuous histories. It's important to recognize that European anti-Semitism is what led Theodor Herzl to start this whole movement in the first place and advocate for this idea. The solution to the Jewish problem in Europe is just have everybody go to Palestine. And of course, Europe was fine with that. It's not like anti-Semitism runs super deep in Europe still to this day. Don't let people fool you. Anyway, but that of course is not a solution for Palestinians. And so what we witnessed in 1948 with the Nakba was an ethnic cleansing campaign. That there were areas allocated to a Jewish state by the UN Partition Plan in 1947, and the Jewish militias and then the Jewish army, Israeli army, set out to ethnically cleanse those areas of Palestinians, and that was the Nakba. So 80% of the Palestinians in areas that are now Israel were driven out of their homes or scared out of their homes and not allowed to return. That's an important thing. They were not allowed to return afterwards. So what happened, what were Palestinians left with? This question of Palestine, it's like an official thing in the UN, the question of Palestine. First it was the Jewish question, or the Jewish problem, now it's the question of Palestine. So I think we need to answer that question and really take stock of where these last 100 years have led us and recognize that there's no safety and security for the state of Israel without the full national and civil rights of Palestinians. It's super simple. Like, we've been through this in this country. Equal rights under the law. You know, discrimination is not a good thing. It doesn't make people happy. It makes them resist. It makes them rebel. And we've witnessed it here in the civil rights era, and it's happening in Palestine. And it's taken all different forms. From the most violent, as what we've witnessed recently, to the most non-violent, which ironically is crushed even more very silently by the state of Israel. So for the United States, as Israel's staunchest ally and best friend, to not take that opportunity to play an honest leadership role and honor the rights of Palestinians to live with dignity in their homeland, finally, once and for all, that's kind of why we are where we are today. That's my take on it. And, hopefully we can get past this kind of what I call mockery of democracy and live up to our Western values. So that looks like a permanent ceasefire, immediate permanent ceasefire, not some floating island that Biden's going to build on the port of Gaza, and then you still can't get the aid to people. Everybody needs a timeout. This is like getting to the level of children where we have to say, time out, everybody stop, you sit there, you sit there. I mean, that's really what we need, and only the US can play that role. And really get on with the business of reimagining the future. It really is up to Palestinians and Israelis to do that, but they need our support, our help, because right now people are at each other's throats, literally. And the only thing in that area that should be destroyed is the system of apartheid, which is perpetuating violence. So I think it's really up to Palestinians and Israelis to redefine that space with grace and humility. Of course, the wounds run deep, but they're so fresh. I mean, there's blood pouring in the street, literally. And the historic trauma of both peoples, whether it's the historic trauma of the Holocaust for the Jews and hundreds of years of persecution, the fear of the Arabs, the Arab world, and the Palestinians. They've been subjugated for 75 years. We have to get past that and envision a shared future. So this memoir that I've written is really about the situation on the ground through my eyes. I didn't really plan to write this while I was living it, but after all the other things I've done, it's like, how can I make a difference? That's all I ever wanted to do, was make a difference. So people have told me that when I share stories, that's powerful. So that's what I ended up doing, was writing this book. It took me 10 years to write it. It's really hard to write about something that's so personal and also relive the history of that place, which is full of trauma. And so it was not an easy write, but it is, I think it gives the reader access to that place through my eyes. You know, going there as an 18-year-old in college, all the way up to, later when I could speak Arabic and really engage with people and add more to the depth of my knowledge and understanding of the place. So you get to not only meet the people I met and learn Arabic with me, you get to smell the smells of the street and hear the sounds of chickens and everything else. You get to really get a sense of the fragmentation of the Palestinian people, how your status determines your access to your homeland, or your access even between like Jerusalem and Gaza and the West Bank inside inside Israel for Israeli citizens, where you can live as internally displaced people who maybe your village was destroyed but you stayed in Israel. So there's lots of stories like that. And what I want to start with, just because we're so focused on Gaza these days, when I was there in 1986, I connected with the organization Save the Children, and the director took me through the Gaza Strip, and I just want to read you a little bit about when I saw Rafah. So I got very sick while I was there, probably kind of sick like people are getting sick right now. I'm not sure why. I mean, it was a definitely very different situation, different. I suspended everything I knew and all the comforts of home to just embrace this opportunity to be literally in people's living rooms. So anyway, this is toward the end of my trip, 1986. Even though I'm ill, I can't leave Gaza without finally meeting with the director of Save the Children, Christa Bruhn. Maybe he can help me make sense of what I've witnessed so far. I pull myself together and meet him in his office in town. My adrenaline is up. In my mind, Save the Children is like UNICEF, vowing to make a difference in the lives of children caught in conflict or poverty. But I quickly realize he's one man facing the insurmountable battle of those forgotten by history. I tell him I wanted to connect much earlier, that I'd like to volunteer with the organization. He seems grateful, if not relieved, to have a fellow American here who's eager to learn about the challenges Palestinians face in Gaza and my willingness to contribute in some way. Perhaps it's better that I first got to experience life in Gaza for myself. He wants to drive me through the Gaza Strip, all the way to the town of Rafah on the border with Egypt. I use the bathroom before we go, relieved to see a flush toilet where I can sit instead of squat, give my low energy level from hardly eating and the ongoing diarrhea. Until, unlike the older cars that fill the streets of Gaza, he has a newer sedan. As we head south on the main road, I look out the window at the Gaza Strip, as if watching a movie, while he tells me of Israeli settlements, illegal according to international law, and segregated roads for Jews, the dire conditions in refugee camps in the area, and the challenges of getting medical supplies and Israeli approval for development projects to improve the lives of Palestinians here. When we reach the end of the Gaza Strip, he directs me to get out of the car and explains the town of Rafah is now divided between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, with a double fence in between, separating Palestinian family members from each other. We walk toward the fence, the long dresses of Palestinian women fluttering in the breeze. The idea of placing a fence through the middle of town seems absurd, but witnessing people call out to each other is heartbreaking. Their fingers clinging to the fence, pulling their faces forward, as if to make their voices more audible. On our way back, we stop at an open clearing, the loose sand seeping under my sandals. The director points to a large rectangle of concrete buried in the sand. This is a water treatment plant, but the Israelis stopped the project, even though Palestinians have a permit to build it. He points beyond the area to a dark lake surrounded by a few palm trees, with a hint of green foliage along the edges. That is raw sewage, he says. In the distance, I see neat rows of farms, the bright green of the crops gleaming in the overhead sun. My stomach turns as my eyes shift from the farms to the lake of sewage and back again. Palestinians are farming right next to contaminated water. No wonder I'm sick. Now I know the water running down the narrow passageway in front of Salam's home is raw sewage. Without adequate water treatment facilities, there's nowhere for the wastewater to go. So it collects here, contaminating groundwater. I think of the children and their bare feet playing in the passageway. My heart aches that Palestinians here have to put up with these conditions. It's my first taste of collective punishment. Israel has the power to block projects and does, leaving Palestinians' hopes for a better life buried in the sand. Israel must be held accountable for this, but how? So, sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? Unfortunately, but that's what I witnessed then. I'm going to jump ahead in time to a chapter. So in 1948, there was the Nakba, and in 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. So the rest of what was once Palestine is all under Israeli control. And we don't hear as much about what happened to the people then. 500,000 people lost their homes. Villages were destroyed again, new ones. And I want to just read, I got to take a walk with some people who lived in the village of Yalo, which is just near Jerusalem. And the villages that were destroyed were made into a park called Canada Park, because it was funded by the Jewish National Fund of Canada. The wildflowers brought to life by the winter rains. So this is April, 1998. And this is kind of what it looks like now. It's rain, everything turns green, it's absolutely beautiful. So the wildflowers brought to life by the winter rains have given way to lush green grasses when I returned to the destroyed village of Yalo, near Ramallah, in April, to join a group of former residents and their descendants to visit the ruins of their village. Then rewalk the same path they followed when the Israeli army forced them to evacuate on foot to make their way to the city of Ramallah in the midst of the Six-Day War of 1967. So I was born in 1967, so this is like my lifetime. We begin our journey in the morning as a caravan of cars from Ramallah. We arrive at the main entrance of Canada Park, established in 1975 on the site of these three villages in an effort to hide their remains. I wish I could ask Nasser's friend Johnny, whose family was driven out of their town of Ramleh in 1948, what he thinks of a park in Israel being named Canada Park. So Johnny and his family grew up in Canada. Doesn't speak Arabic, and he got to come as like a Canadian tourist to see his homeland while we were there. So we leave our cars in the parking lot and walk into the park, the older residents of Yalo taking the lead. One woman in a traditional black embroidered dress and long white headscarf must be in her 60s, a grown woman when her village was reduced to rubble. Her brow is firm and her gaze steady. Her feet follow the path with no hesitation. Her entire gait flows forward from her forehead to her footsteps. We walk for some time before the women leave the path and continue up a gravel road. My eyes follow the road as it winds up the hill out of sight. I spot clusters of fruit trees on either side of the road, then the stone corner of the remains of a house. This must be a village road. My heart descends into my stomach as my eyes scan the landscape for more remains. But there are no houses in sight, only rubble amidst the clusters of sabr. And sabr are the cactus plants that Palestinians used to, or do, plant between their properties. And so destroyed villages are like overgrown with these cactus plants called sabr, which also means patience in Arabic. The group proceeds up the road. At one point, one of the older women points out the names of the families who used to live there, as if their houses are still standing. Then she leaves the road and walks between the invisible houses, surrounded by fruit, almond, and olive trees. The woman's voice is heavy. The more names she utters, the more disbelief in her voice, until it falls silent. We reach a plateau with the ruins of a high wall where the village center used to be. Along the way, we see the concrete rubble of what must have been newer homes. Another woman points toward a pile of stone rubble, surrounded on one side by a cluster of fruit trees. Hon Kandar Sitti. This was my grandmother's house. She kneels down and pushes away some of the rocks with her bare hands. Those who brought hand tools with them offer her a spade, but she keeps clearing rocks that were once the stone walls of her grandmother's house, until she's made a small depression in the pile. Her eyes are wide open. Her gaze is focused on her hands. Suddenly her shoulders are still, and I hear her gasp. She picks up a triangular shard of white china with the remnants of a deep blue floral pattern. Hadi min Sohun Sitti. This was my grandmother's china. Her eyes dart up at those of us standing around. Kunna nokal minhin. We used to eat off them. She continues digging and finds a few more pieces and tucks them into her pocket. Then she gets up and walks toward the back of the destroyed house. She bends over again and tugs at a piece of metal protruding out of the rubble. Ya Allah, makinatul khayta. Oh my God, my grandmother's sewing machine. Now the tears flow freely down her smooth cheeks. Her dark eyes scrunched in heartache. The earth below will not surrender the machine. She runs her hand back and forth over the frame as if it's her grandmother's arm. كانت ستي تخيط هنا عند الشباك. My grandmother used to sew here by the window. The woman's image blurs as my own eyes pool up with tears. I take a sip of water, hoping to swallow the lump in my throat, but it remains stubborn. I look around, scanning for a neighbor's house next door or across the street. Piles of rubble are all I see. It has been nearly 32 years since the village was destroyed, but the wounds feel fresh and open. A whole community of people with the rug ripped out from under it. And I'll stop there. So that was a typical practice, or is in Israel, to plant trees over destroyed villages. The Jewish National Fund distributed what are called blue boxes to Jewish families all around the world, and people would give money to plant a tree in Israel, not knowing the trees were used to cover the remains of destroyed villages. So there's a film called My Tree about a Jewish man who goes to find his tree that was dedicated at his bar mitzvah, and he finds out where that tree was planted and he finds out the history of the land beneath those trees. It's really quite moving. I encourage you to look that up. So, how are we doing on time? I have no idea.
I think by 7 we can stop, and then we have a few questions.
Okay, all right.
So
Well,
we have 5 more minutes or something.
so I think it's pretty powerful just to hear. I was in Germany when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. I spent years going back and forth. My father was a professor. He ended up specializing in East German literature, and so he got to go every year, and he brought students from here, and his German students, and they got to study. They spent a summer in East Germany behind the Iron Curtain, as it was called, and so this piece is, well, you'll see about the wall, which is, restrictions on Palestinian life and livelihood are so pervasive wherever you are over there, and this is about the wall. So we're about to go to a conference with we're invited to speak at a conference at Ben Gurion University in the Negev from a Bedouin researcher there, and we're on our way. And I'm just gonna skip ahead and so we're driving. I'm stunned at the unfolding of events before me. There, right in front of me, a road is becoming a wall. To my right, the segments are already in place, anchored together as one contiguous stretch of concrete that continues into the distance. Just behind the end of the wall, the segments are being unloaded from a huge flatbed truck onto the street, then lifted into place by crane. The wall is being built right before my eyes. The separation of communities being set in stone, or rather concrete, in real time. The Berlin Wall was put up in the middle of the night, so people awoke to a new reality. But this wall is being constructed, one segment of concrete at a time, in broad daylight. I walk across the still invisible line where the wall will soon cut the town of El-Ram off from the rest of Jerusalem. There, on the other side, I find a flatbed with prefabricated segments in full view, like a toy truck, with blocks on it, awaiting a child to put the pieces in place. Set the sections neatly next to each other, so his mother can praise him for aligning them just right. But these are no blocks, and this is no child's play. I'm baffled at how Palestinians are walking around, going on with their day as if nothing's happening, and yet their lives are being redefined, one slab of concrete at a time. The wall creates sides, borders, more restrictions on access, more confiscation of land. My stomach turns as I witness this crude vision of security become reality. One people's security, another's confinement. Gaza is already an outdoor prison. Now, the isolation of the West Bank behind concrete walls and electric fences is taking shape in front of me, like in Berlin. I don't want to witness history, not like this. I lived to see the Berlin Wall come down, only to witness the Israeli wall go up. Right before my eyes, the weight of those concrete slabs presses down on my shoulders. I'm sad for the Israelis who feel they need a wall to feel safe. As for the Palestinians who have to live in its shadow, I'm sad for my children who will have to pass through this wall to see the rest of Palestine. I'm sad for all the Palestinians already barred from returning to their villages, their fruit trees and olive groves, their treasured cities, the sea. The more Palestinians are confined, the less they can experience their homeland with their own eyes. Palestine becomes something only to imagine, to remember, to dream about, not to set foot on, live and breathe. Even for those living in the West Bank and Gaza, or in areas that are now Israel, they're all limited to a piece, a corner, and left to imagine the rest. Their stories, their places, their connection to the land are left out of Israel's history books. Is it still real? Palestine? If my daughter can tell her CD's story of the last sesame harvest in 1948, isn't it real? Sometimes people ask me, Palestine, where's that? I always respond with a question. Do you know where Israel is? They always provide the same answer. Yes, of course. Well, then you know where Palestine is. Palestine is Israel, and Israel is Palestine. And I will stop there. So, anyway, I'd love to open up for questions. If you have questions about writing, questions about what's going on, questions about me, or whatever you want to ask about. I will do my best to. But I do want to tell you about the cover of my book. This is a painting from the late Palestinian artist Ismail Shammout. So his family was from the city of Lid, which, together with the city of Romley, where Johnny is from, that I mentioned, the one who grew up in Canada. Both those cities were depopulated in 1948 during Ramadan, and the people of Lid actually had to walk in the summer heat. Like right now, Ramadan is, it's warm today, but it's relatively it's not like 100 degrees. So I call it the Palestinian Trail of Tears, if you know anything about American history, with Native Americans being forced to relocate, and how many people died on the way. So that's his background. He grew up in East Germany, of all places. He's no longer living, but I got in touch with his sons, who graciously offered me to use this painting of his that is called Life Prevails. So in spite of all he suffered, that he couldn't raise his kids, he raised them in German, and in Germany, this painting just really celebrates life. Like, this is about a wedding, and all the next generation of kids, and the sea, and all the landmarks of all the places Palestinians hold dear. And there's a card of oranges to represent the Jaffa
not sure how many people are.
Yeah, I don't know if we have, but yeah,
I think a lot, but-
that's the painting. So, sorry, I should have.
No, that's okay. I mean,
attention to turning that
it's
way.
hard to look at both ways, and we don't have
Yeah.
really cameras.
Anyway, so, questions? Don't be shy. How many of you know some Arabic or Hebrew or, come on, raise your hand, okay. Some German? Okay. How many of you have ever been abroad, studied abroad, have seen something besides the United States? Okay, I'm just curious. And, yeah, so, come on, what do you want to know? Yes?
So a lot of people talk about either a two-state solution or a one-state solution. Do you believe that is possible with the prevailing attitude of Israelis toward the Palestinian people as less than them, as less than human? Because I personally, I can't see, I mean, even if it was a two-state solution, Israel's currently bombing Lebanon, Syria, and one other country, I believe. So I just don't see how that would happen, and I guess, what is your opinion on that?
Well, when things are really bad, it's really hard to imagine anything's possible. And yet, usually it's when things get so bad that nobody can even do anything else, that maybe there's a turn of events. It's not necessarily my place to advocate, but I've been holding roundtables for 20 years on this topic. And as I said, Israel and Palestine are already a binational state. The problem is the policy that privileges Jewish people in that land over Palestinians, regardless of their status. And that's what needs to change. So what gives me hope is that even if they're fewer in numbers and not as loud as, say, somebody like Ben-Gvir or Netanyahu or Smotrich, who are in the Israeli government, in spite of their rhetoric and their policies and practices toward the Palestinians, there are Palestinians and Israelis working together right now and have been for decades. And especially in this time where things are especially bad, there's still people coming together and seeing that there's no future for Israel if it's going to live at the expense of Palestine. And there's no such thing as just wiping Israel off the map. It's already there. Two people in the same land, but the policy is the issue. And so to say, that of course there's all these accusations that if you call for one state solution, you're calling for the dismantling of the state of Israel. What you're calling for is the dismantling of apartheid policies, which was done in South Africa. There were people in this country, and there still are, who don't consider everyone who lives here even human or deserving of. But what changed is the law and the education, and of course we have a long way to go in this country. We are so not there, but we also have come a long way. And so there's precedence for people finding a way to reconcile these kinds of differences. Certainly South Africa, you had a very small white minority population that was controlling the entire country. There's still problems there, but things changed. And they can change there too, and they have to. But as long as American and Western policy gives Israel the green light to continue doing what it's doing, why wouldn't it? It has, no one's saying stop. Biden needs to pick up the phone and say stop. Real simple, stop. No more, no more weapons, no more anything. We have the power to do that, and we choose not to as a nation in our policy. So that's a real problem. And we're not doing Israel a favor. There's more attacks on Jews all around the world than there ever was. What is that? Is that safety for the Jewish people? Is that Israel as the safe haven for the Jewish people? No. So we have to get past those hurdles. So I remain optimistic. I'm in touch with people who are connecting and having their little demonstrations in Tel Aviv and connecting with people and advocating for change here and there. And that could only grow because there's really no other way. Yeah.
So kind of connecting to that a little bit, what do because obviously you want the rhetoric to change and for advocation for a ceasefire, but is there anything that you see that the West has a responsibility beyond that, or would it start, do you feel it would cross a line into we're just once again meddling in their affairs, because you don't want to cross too far and no longer allow self-determination, but it seems like a situation where somebody might need to act as a moderator. So I'm just wondering how you see the responsibility being doled out.
You do need a moderator. When people have that much trauma, that much pain, that much blood flowing on both sides, in both streets, you need help. And the problem with the United States is it has not been an honest broker. I'm sure you've heard that before. You know, we've always kind of sided with, you know, we let Israel direct the peace processes and the policies, and we let Israel decide which issues were just too hard to talk about, like Jerusalem or the right of return for Palestinians. And that was a mistake, because those, you know, it's a non-starter. You know, why does any Jew in the world get to go to Israel and get instant citizenship within 48 hours? And Palestinians who either were born there or who, you know, it's your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother at this point, you're not even allowed to go visit, much less live there? Are you kidding? Like, what is that? So, honest broker is honest broker. It's like, what goes for you goes for me. If you're gonna have safety and security, why is it only Israel's safety and security? Why are Palestinians never deserving of safety and security? Who's supposed to defend them? You don't want Hamas to try to defend Palestinians? Well, make some room for that. You know, there's no room for that in the discourse, and that's why things escalate out of control. And so the United States has, you know, we support Israel. We give Israel more money than any other country in the world. And it's not like it's some developing, you know, nation. It has like an incredibly strong economy. It's the startup nation. It has a formidable army, and yet we are supplying
nuclear power.
Yeah, on top of that. So it's like, you know, why aren't we supporting democracy? Why aren't our values being reflected in the way that we deal with a situation? And, you know, Jews say, you know, this is our right to self-determination. Well, what about Palestinians? Why was that never in the cards? You know, the Balfour Declaration didn't even name Palestinians in 1897. You know, they just signed it off, let's make a Jewish homeland, and we'll protect the rights of the people who are there, you know, as if they're sheep or something. So, you know, there's definitely a different way of doing it, and we have to show some leadership. And as the strongest nation in the world, that, you know, Israel couldn't do what it's doing without American policy. And it takes education of also our elected officials who are kind of as brainwashed as many Jews admit they have been by thinking, oh, it's support Israel or nothing. So there's a lot of education and change. So yeah, sorry, I didn't know.
It was me. So I heard you mention Hamas a moment ago, and talking about them defending the Palestinian people. What's your take on, I mean, American media outlets, U.S. media outlets right now, almost without exception that I've ever heard, refer to, always in the same sentence, Hamas, the terrorist group Hamas, and as if there were no doubt that that's all that they are. But Palestinians don't feel that it's a terrorist group. So I was just wondering, I mean, I don't know if you want to go there in this conversation, but just what's your take on what they're doing and what their goals are, and in what ways they're seeking to protect the Palestinian people?
Well, all Palestinian groups are outlawed by Israel. All the historic ones, the Palestine Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, you know, it doesn't matter what they are, and most leaders who have emerged were assassinated or put in jail. So Hamas, what Hamas did on October 7th is horrific. I don't need to tell you that. But Hamas historically has been, you know, they're the ones who were elected in Gaza to govern. And it was the West that rejected that leadership in Gaza. And then, you know, I mean, you can talk about how the Israel played Hamas off against the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, so it doesn't have to negotiate any kind of long-term settlement with the Palestinians. So definitely Netanyahu has his hands in that. But I think what I would remind people is that Hamas has been there for a while now. You know, we're talking about 17 years of siege. Hamas runs United Nations schools. Hamas runs the health ministry. You know, it's the government of the place that chose, you know, with its military wing to do this act. And the chapter I didn't read, which is important, and it's one I assigned to those of you who got to read it. But in 2018, Palestinians marched to the border fence. That was called the March of Return. That was a non-violent act of resistance. People marched just like this, with the shirts on their backs, marched to the fence and asked for two things: to lift the blockade, which had already been going on for, you know, just do 2024 minus 18, and you got it, and the right of return. You know, the Palestinians who live in Gaza are refugees from communities that are now in Israel. And a lot of the places, believe it or not, that they're from are still vacant land. So refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and in Gaza. At least half of those villages and village sites are still there. And of course the 12 cities that were taken over are still there. So people are asking to have the right to go home. And as I said, Jews have the right to go to Israel and settle even in the West Bank as settlers. So they asked for that, and what was the response? They were shot, mostly in the knees. It was like a game for Israeli soldiers to see how many knees they exploded in a given day. And so that's what nonviolence gets you. So why does Hamas choose a different path? Let's ask ourselves how we fail the situation, how we fail to answer to Palestinians' right to self-determination, to live with dignity in their homeland. That's on us. That's not on Hamas. Hamas is just responding to the lack of goodwill on the part of the entire world, and certainly on the Israeli government. So I'm not excusing Hamas. I'm explaining that these things don't come out of nowhere. Mubarak Awad started the Nonviolent Center way back in the 80s during the first Intifada, which was largely nonviolent resistance. You know, people did strikes and boycotts, and that was crushed and kind of repackaged into this Oslo Accords, which just normalized the occupation and gave the PA the right to collect taxes and garbage and run schools and still live under occupation. So, you know, what is that? So, yeah, I mean, we give room for, you know, things fill the void. That's why we have Netanyahu and Ben Gvir. Nobody's countering them, you know, and people are convinced that this is the way to get more extreme on both sides. So that's my answer. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I just had a comment about that. I don't know if you ever heard of Jeffrey Sachs. He's an economist. He kind of runs like a think tank. And he's one of those people, he was maybe ahead of his time a few months ago with the non-committed thing. He left the Democratic Party, I think, as a way of saying, you guys don't know what you're doing. But he addressed the UN, and he said, you know, we can't end all these wars right now with these policies. You know, we don't need to have war. Even I'm an economist, it's bad for the economy, you know, except for the people, you know, the war in industrial complex, right? And so then I showed this video to some students, and they were like, oh, that's a nice idea, but it'll never happen. And I thought, wow, why not? You know, but I think maybe their thoughts were, I mean, not criticizing them. I mean, I respect that there's been too much trauma for peace.
Well, we're definitely in a harder place, but it's still, you know, there have been people whose families have been killed or have been taken hostage who still say this is not the way. Yeah. So anyway.
Do I have time for, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I did, yeah. Okay, so there's a post that's been going around on social media that has basically said, like, if you killed my parents and my family and all my cousins and my grandparents to destroy Hamas, the first thing I would do is create Hamas too. In what ways can we, as people who clearly our government is not listening to us, how can we support those kids? Because I buy electronic SIM cards, and I donate when I can, but I don't work a ton. Is there more that we could be doing?
Well, what has happened on the ground is there's increased separation. So when I first went there in 1986, we could travel, we could go to Jaffa. Of course, the family couldn't move back there, but we could just take a bus and from Ashkelon and go to the north to Acre. We could go to En Gedi. We could go to Masada, where Jewish Israeli school children go to learn about history of the Jewish people in that space. I mean, there used to be a lot more interaction. There used to be, Jewish Israelis would come to Jenin because it's like, which is where my whole extended family is, and get their car fixed or grab some groceries. It was cheaper, and then you engage in conversation. So what's happened is there's so much more separation. There are things that didn't help. There are things that led to the separation, but the separation is by design. The more you don't interact with somebody, the easier it is to otherize them. And it goes both ways. Kids in Gaza have never even seen anything but Gaza. They've grown up there. They only hear the stories. Now they see, now of course their impression is even worse. Like, okay, all Israel can do is bomb us in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, and now 2024. And even in the West Bank, Palestinians say they refer to Jewish Israelis as Yehud, the Jews, because that's what they see. But there was interaction. There was more interaction, and so the separation is really undermining people's ability to see themselves in the other person and to have a sense of shared humanity. But there are people who cross those lines and have the courage. I mean, there are Israeli human rights organizations that go and help people with their harvest, the olive harvest, so that the Israeli army doesn't come and interfere, or settlers don't attack them, or they at least document it so that one day we can say, hey, look what you guys did. So that's what gives me hope, is that people, in spite of the walls and the checkpoints and the ID cards and the limitations that people do, there are people who are looking past the separation. And about the kids who say that, again, whose fault is that? That a child would aspire to be Hamas 2.0. Can you blame them? If literally there's like a term for kids now who they're the only surviving member of their entire extended family, and families are huge there, where like babies are going to grow up and have zero anybody who is actually from their family, and that's a reality, and that's trauma beyond anything any of us know how to deal with that. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of building community. It's a lot of soul searching, and it needs to happen. And some people are doing that difficult work, and some people are just grabbing for the gun. And so, it remains to be seen. But I think you always need to try to. I mean, there are groups of, even back in the Second Intifada when there were like suicide bombings, and some of the parents of who lost their Palestinian children from the Israeli army at the time, and Jewish Israelis who lost their family members to a suicide bombing, have formed organizations and are talking. We're saying, we have this shared experience of violence. We need to have a shared experience of engagement, because that's the only way to live in peace and security in that space. So we need to encourage it and support the people who are brave enough to do that. Yeah. And some people just can't get past the trauma. It's true. And we have to give them space to be where they are, too. But not let them run the government, because it doesn't doesn't play out very well. Anyway, well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
you giving me a
Copy of
chance
the
to come back to